A whisper in the dark, trapped below. Welcome to Vale Files. I am your host, Thorn. Where are you tuning in from today? Your words make this special. Let's uncover the truth. It was on a raw November morning, with a sour fog pressing against the panes of Baker Street and the lamps still burning in a grudging yellow at 11 o'clock, that the singular affair of the whisper beneath the floorboards first intruded upon our quiet. I had called to find Holmes in one of those intervals of comparative indolence which always preceded some notable exertion. His violin lay idle upon the chair, the bow at right angles to it with an exactness which betrayed, to my eye, that nervous precision which comes upon him when his energies have no channel. He stood at the window with his back to the fire and his long, thin hands in the pockets of his dressing gown, watching the blurred shapes of hansoms sliding along the road like phantoms in a lantern slide. "London," he remarked, without turning, "is muttering to itself this morning. One hears it even through glass." Before I could reply, our landlady's tread announced a visitor, and a moment later a lady was shown in whose pallor and bright strained eyes told at once of a night without repose. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes," she said, rather as one might clutch at a ledge. "And this is Dr. Watson. I am grateful that you will see me without appointment. I am Mrs. Lydia Winterbourne of Montague Street." Holmes's manner altered with that quick transition which never failed to impress me. The languor was gone, the eyes had their keen light. "Pray be seated, Mrs. Winterbourne." "We are at your service." "You have come from Montague Street this morning?" "From the house of my sister," she returned. "I could not remain another hour in mine." Her gloved hands worked in her lap. "Mr. Holmes, I beg you, if you cannot credit what I have to tell, at least come and hear it with your own ears before you judge me mad." "My dear madam," said Holmes gently, "it is our experience that the improbable is the constant companion of the true. Compose yourself, and let us have the facts in the order most natural to you." She drew a breath and began in that level tone with which strong natures deliver themselves of a burden. "My husband, Mr. Arthur Winterbourne, died 2 years ago, leaving me with our little boy and the house at number 14, Montague Street. It is an old place, the floors are of oak, and the rooms high with cornices and shutters. My late husband's study is on the first floor beneath the nursery, and looks upon the square. Yesterday evening we were hosting a small committee meeting of the Ladies' Hospital Society, Mrs. Forster, our vicar's wife, with Miss Amy Vale and Mrs. Redworth. My sister, Miss Eliza Harrow, supped with us, and Mr. Henry Deacon, our solicitor, had called in the afternoon to leave certain papers concerning my boy's settlement. He had requested, too, the sight of Arthur's will, which is kept in the study safe. At 8:30, the ladies sat in the drawing-room while I went up to the nursery to quiet my son. He had been fretful all day. Nurse Hannah was with him, and Miss Vale followed me, for she has a way with children. We had hardly set foot in the nursery when Nurse started and clutched me. "Hark, ma'am," she whispered, and raised a finger. At first I heard nothing save the rattle of the window sash and the tick of the clock. Then, Mr. Holmes, then there came a voice. It was a whisper, low and distinct, as if someone spoke from the very boards beneath our feet. It said, "Oh, I can repeat it only as it was said. Down here, down, do you hear? Not yet, not yet." Mrs. Winterbourne's composure broke for an instant. She pressed a handkerchief to her lips. Holmes did not stir, but I saw the slightest inclination of his head. Miss Vale cried out that it must be some trick, and she stamped upon the boards, calling, "Who is there?" There was no reply. We called Hannah's husband, Jonah, he is our man of all work, to fetch a lamp and pry up one of the boards, for the sound seemed to come from the very centre of the room. He fetched his tools, and we sent the child with Miss Vale to the drawing-room. Jonah loosened 2 boards, and we all bent with the lamp. There is only lath and plaster between the nursery and the ceiling of the study below, Mr. Holmes. We saw nothing but dust, a spider's web, and the plaster itself. It seemed madness. I sent Jonah down to the study, thinking some person might be concealed there, but the door was locked upon the inside. We thought it strange, for Mr. Deacon had been with us earlier, and the key should have been in the drawer. Yet there it was, turned within. "Was there a fire in the study?" asked Holmes in so level a tone that his question slid into the narrative. "Yes, banked low, for the evening was cold. We dared not force the door, for I could not bring myself to such violence in Arthur's room without a man to advise us. I sent for a constable. When he came, he forced the lock with Jonah's aid. Mr. Holmes, Mr. Deacon, was within, lying half upon the hearth-rug, with his hand stretched toward the fender. His face—" She faltered, then went on resolutely. It was the face of a man suddenly struck down. There was no wound that we could see, no blood. The window was latched within, the shutters barred, and there is no other entrance but the door by which we had burst. The safe stood open. The packet Mr. Deacon had brought was there, but the will, Arthur's will, was not. Holmes's lids drooped for a moment, as if to veil some inward movement of the mind. "Who has a duplicate key of the study?" "No one. I keep the keys of the private rooms in a small case upon my watch chain. The study key was in the drawer of the escritoire in the drawing-room. Mr. Deacon must have taken it when he went down. When we found him, the key was in the lock upon the inside." "Pray continue," said Holmes. "What followed upon the discovery?" "Inspector Lestrade came from Scotland Yard. He examined the room and pronounced that Mr. Deacon had died of the heart. He says the safe was carelessly left open and that the will may have been misplaced. But, Mr. Holmes, I know the exact order of those papers. I placed the will there with my own hand a week ago, and—" Here her voice sank and she leaned toward us. The whisper came again, later. It came while the inspector was below. "My sister and I were in the nursery, for I could not bear to leave my child." The voice came through the floor in the same dreadful tone. "Not yet. Wait." Eliza heard it. She can bear witness. When we shrieked, Lestrade himself ran up and called out from below. He insists that no sound came in the study. Yet we heard it, as I hear my own thoughts. Can you wonder that I left the house at dawn to seek you? Holmes had not moved, save that his fingers, which had lain in a church steeple upon his waistcoat, now meshed and unmeshed themselves softly. You say Mr. Deacon was your solicitor. Had he, to your knowledge, any enemy? Any client whose affairs touched your own? None that I know, she answered. He was a steady man of 54, a widower, exact in his habits. He called at 4 o'clock with the packet, took tea with us and left, saying he might return at 8 to compare inventories if it were not inconvenient. He returned at 8, and I sent Jonah to bring him to the study. That is all. And the household? Your sister, the nurse, the man Jonah, any others? Only Mrs. Dudley, our cook, who is old and somewhat deaf, and the housemaid, Alice, who was dismissed a fortnight ago for impertinence. My sister Eliza has been with me this week. Miss Vale remained after the meeting to keep me company. Holmes turned at last to the fire, flicked a thought into the flames with the poker, and faced our visitor again. His eyes were brighter than the coals. Mrs. Winterbourne, you have done wisely to come. I confess that I should like to hear this whisper with my own ears. Dr. Watson and I will accompany you at once to Montague Street, if you can bear the return. Pray do not be alarmed if my methods appear eccentric. We must, before all else, test the conditions in which the sound was heard, and satisfy ourselves as to the manner of Mr. Deacon's death. She rose with a look of mingled relief and dread. I can bear anything, Mr. Holmes, if only you will not call me mad. Holmes gave a little bow, touched his violin with the tenderest of gestures, as if it were an old friend he must leave to its own devices, and reached for his coat. Madness, said he, with a flash of his old humour, is often but the name which the unimaginative give to logic that runs before them. Come, Watson, London is muttering, and we must attend to what it says. It was no great distance to Montague Street, and yet, as often happens when the mind is preoccupied, the journey seemed to contract under one's feet. Mrs. Winterbourne sat opposite us in the cab, with hands closely locked and eyes fixed upon that inward scene from which no outward movement could distract her. Holmes, for his part, relapsed into the profoundest abstraction, the lids drawn almost to a close, the lips compressed, and the long, delicate fingers beating a noiseless measure upon his knee. I have learned that this outward torpor in him is but the sheath of a very keen activity, as a sword may sleep in velvet while the hand that wears it is already measuring its work. Number. 14 Montague Street stood aloof and sombre among its fellows with a certain prim air of respectability that clung to its very door-knocker. A uniformed constable paced before it. Within, the hall smelled of beeswax and coal dust. Mrs. Winterbourne's sister met us upon the threshold of the drawing-room, a spare, self-contained gentlewoman with the resolute mouth of one who could be relied upon in an emergency. Behind her hovered a young lady of pleasant countenance and anxious eyes, whom I took for Miss Vale, and a robust woman in a plain cap, Nurse Hannah, who clutched her apron in both hands. The man Jonah, a broad-shouldered fellow with a dark jaw roughened by a day's neglect, lurked by the service door. And from somewhere below came the comfortable bluster of an elderly cook talking to the kettle. Holmes bowed to the ladies with that grave courtesy which put even the most startled visitor at ease. "You are Miss Harrow? You have shown firmness where most would have lost their heads. If you will allow it, I must first see the study exactly as it was when the inspector left it." "Inspector Lestrade remains below," said Miss Harrow. "He came again this morning to make certain notes, and is, I believe, still at his work." "Excellent." "When Scotland Yard and Baker Street keep the same hours, London is safer," Holmes returned, and the flicker at the corners of his mouth took any sting from the words. We found Lestrade in the study, a compact, alert figure, whose pinched features lighted at the sight of my companion as a terrier's might at the opening of a rat-hole. "So, Mr. Holmes, you have a fancy for whispers today? You'll hear none here. We have had enough of fancies in this house. I shall content myself with facts," said Holmes with perfect good humour. "Pray do not stir from what you are about, Lestrade. Watson, oblige me by touching nothing. The room had that cold order which belongs to a chamber seldom used. Books in sober bindings, a large escritoire, a small iron safe set into a recess, and between them and the window a Turkey carpet which made a warm island before the hearth. The fire had been mended, yet its arrangement betrayed an unfamiliar hand. Upon the fender a faint grey bloom of ash lay like powder on a soldier's shoulder. The key still depended within the lock of the inner door, a new escutcheon showing bright where the wood about the staple had been riven by forcible entry. The window was secured, the shutters within barred. Holmes stood at the threshold for the space of 3 breaths, as a hound might poise upon the scent. "Permit me," he murmured, and then, in the twinkling of an eye, he was across the rug on his knees, the lens glimmering between his fingers. He inspected the hearth-rug inch by inch, the fender, the irons. He put his cheek to the edge of the fender, as a huntsman might to the ground, then tapped it lightly with the nail of his forefinger and listened as if to a glass. He peered into the mouth of the grate, reached delicately among the ashes with the tip of the poker, and drew forth a small blackened fragment no larger than the nail of my little finger. He held it up. It showed a faint smear of blue upon one charred surface. "Sealing wax," said I. "So it would appear," Holmes assented, yet his voice had that guarded tone which told me the object was more to him than he chose to reveal. He wrapped it carefully in a scrap of paper and slipped it into his pocket-book. A moment later he uttered a soft exclamation and, with the blade of his penknife, teased from between 2 bars of the fender a glistening speck which, under the lens, had the look of a tiny bead. He turned it upon the sheet of his notebook. "A fragment of melted varnish or lacquer," he observed to the room at large. The fender has lately borne a heat which it does not ordinarily endure." Lestrade, who had watched these evolutions with the sardonic tolerance of a man who has been too often dazzled to be at ease in the light, shrugged his shoulders. "A gentleman fell upon the rug, Mr. Holmes, and the fire was near him. I have known fenders to feel heat in such conditions." "There are heats and heats," Holmes returned, but he said no more. He had moved to the safe, which stood open as Mrs. Winterbourne had described. Within were bundles of papers labelled in a firm, feminine hand, and a tray fitted to receive small valuables. He did not touch these, but examined narrowly the dust within the recess, breathing upon it, blowing it gently, and once lifting from the bottom a hair, long, pale, and very fine, which he held to the light and glanced toward Miss Harrow's brown hair, to Miss Vale's chestnut, to Mrs. Winterbourne's fair, then, with a motion of the wrist, sent it adrift again. From the safe he passed to the escritoire and its drawers, to the key in the lock, to the door itself, upon which he bestowed a most minute attention, not upon the place where it had been forced, but upon the iron tongue of the lock and the brass work about it. He measured something with his eye from the bottom of the door to the floor, and from the threshold to the first knot in the boards, and made, with his pencil, a short mark upon the skirting. "What do you make of it, Mr. Holmes?" Lestrade demanded at last, with that half-impatient, half-hopeful manner which he could never quite help assuming in my friend's presence. "I make of it," said Holmes, "that Mr. Deacon died suddenly, stretched, as you say, toward the fender, in a room closed from within by means which would satisfy 9 juries out of 10, that a paper sealed with blue wax has been subjected to fire, that the fender has borne not the casual heat of a fallen brand, but a steady application at a point just here, and that, pray do not move, Watson, upon the nap of this rug there lies a faint, gritty deposit, not elsewhere present in the room." He had taken from his pocket a small glass bottle and a card spatula, and was, to my astonishment, collecting with the most delicate of gestures some almost impalpable powder from a triangle of the rug's surface. "Plaster," he went on softly, "not the soot of the grate, nor house dust. A friable plaster with a trace of lime. One does not bring this upon one's boots from a London pavement." In November, Jonah had edged nearer in a clumsy pretence of polishing the brass upon the coal scuttle. His heavy boots, I observed, were liberally encrusted about the welt with the drier mud of some yard or mews. Holmes's glance rested upon them for a fraction of a second, and went on without a pause. "If you have done below, Mr. Holmes," said Mrs. Winterbourne timidly from the doorway, might you hear the place above?" "I cannot cross it alone. We will go up at once," Holmes answered. "Lestrade, I beg that nothing be disturbed while I am aloft. The conditions below and those above have, I think, a certain relation which may presently be made plain." The nursery was a large, bright chamber by day, but now the fog pressed whitely at the window, and the little bed, with its white canopy, took on an air that touched me in spite of myself. Nurse Hannah's big hands trembled as she drew back. "I will not deny, sir," she whispered, "that I have no taste for ghosts. The Lord made what voices he required, and they come through mouths, not planks." Holmes smiled upon her. "Ghosts have their preferences, nurse, and so have sounds." "Where did you stand when you heard it?" "There, sir, by the hearth, holding the little master." Miss Vale was nigh the middle board, and my lady just so. She placed them with a fidelity which pleased Holmes mightily. He glanced at the boards. They were wide old oak, dark with age, and one near the centre showed fresh chisel marks where it had lately been lifted. He knelt and, laying his ear upon the seam, remained perfectly motionless for a long half-minute. Then he rose, crossed to the skirting, and examined a row of bell-pulls which communicated with the basement. He gave one a slight vibration, and listened, not here, but with his head bent to the floor near the place nurse had indicated. A light came into his eyes. "Watson," said he, "you will oblige me by going down to the study. Stand upon the hearthrug and call in an ordinary conversational tone. Use any phrase that occurs to you. Do not bawl. Lestrade, keep the room clear, if you please, and listen. I shall be sufficiently occupied above. I did, as I was bidden, and was hardly upon the rug, when Holmes's cane gave 3 soft taps upon the nursery floor. I spoke, at first absurdly conscious of the sound of my own voice in that silent chamber, then, with more freedom, calling up some indifferent remark about our cabman's extortionate fare. When I returned, after perhaps 2 minutes, Holmes had his cheek again to the boards, his hand upon the lowest bell-pull. "You heard, Lestrade?" he asked, when the inspector came stumping up after me. "I heard nothing but Dr. Watson's polite observations to the air," said Lestrade. "If this is a game, Mr. Holmes, I have not the counters for it." "And you, nurse?" The woman's eyes were very wide. "I heard him, sir, but faint and far, like a gentleman speaking in his sleep. It came from down there, sure as I live. Twice it came. Fair, extortionate cabman." Miss Vale gave a little cry. "It is the same, Lydia." The sound lies in the very wood. Holmes straightened himself, and for a moment the hawk was in his face. "Wood is a better messenger than most men credit," he said lightly. "We have, you observe, a condition by which a voice uttered below may be conveyed upwards to a place very near the centre of this room, while the converse experiment, speech above to ear below, fails. I will not detain you with the physics of it. It is enough that the fact exists, but we heard words that were not ours." Miss Harrow persisted with practical directness. "Who, then, spoke last night?" "An excellent question, which I hope to answer before your fire is 2 inches lower," Holmes replied. He was crawling now along the skirting, tapping, tap, tap, at intervals, and once pausing to smell at a tiny knot-hole, as a dog might at a mouse-run. He thrust his cane beneath the bed, brought it out, tapped the hearthstone, and, with a sudden movement, set his hand flat upon a rosette of plaster around a bell wire where it entered the floor. His fingers pressed, turned, and he gave a soft whistle through his teeth. "What is it?" I asked. He looked up at me with that half-droll, half-kindly glance he sometimes bestows when the pupil has failed to see the simplest proposition in Euclid. "A small eccentricity in the carpenter's manner, Watson. Nothing more. Do you remark that the bell wire here, unlike the others, has a sleeve of leather where it passes through the flooring? Curious. Yet why should we suppose that a workman's whim is proof of crime? We will not. We will only remember." There came now a sound which made us all start, the smallest sighing murmur, so faint that one might have set it down to the wind fingering at the sash. It gathered, became a whisper, a voice, distinct and unearthly because of its very stillness. "Not yet!" "Wait!" Nurse Hannah dropped her apron with a smothered exclamation and fell upon her knees, crossing herself. Miss Vale clung to Mrs. Winterbourne, and even Miss Harrow's colour fled. Lestrade, to do him justice, strode straight to the place and hammered with his heel, as if to pinion the offender beneath his soul. Holmes neither started nor stamped. He had the air of a man who has waited for a friend at the very spot where that friend is accustomed to appear. His eyes, bright and remote, were upon the bell-plate under his hand. "Hush," he said softly. "There will be another, now." The whisper came a second time, the same syllables, the same spacing, so close upon the first that one might have believed them an echo. Not yet. Wait Holmes had his ear to the floor before the last breath of it died. He marked the board with his pencil, then rose at once. "Enough," he said briskly. "Mrs. Winterbourne, you shall sleep tonight if I can contrive it. Lestrade, I think your interest will be served by accompanying me for 10 minutes. I must see your man outside, and the pavement before this house. Watson, a word with Jonah." We withdrew to the landing, and Holmes drew the man aside with a friendly nod. "You are handy with tools, Jonah." "As much as any, sir." "You forced the study door last night?" "With the inspector and me together, sir." It were a stout lock. And you lifted the nursery boards? A neat job. You have a light touch. The fellow's eyes shifted. I do what I'm told, sir. So do we all in our degree. Holmes's tone was careless, but I saw the knuckles whiten on the head of his cane. If you should discover any loose wire upon this floor between now and my return, pray be so good as to leave it loose. Dr. Watson will admire your obedience. When we went down, Holmes paused in the hall to ask Mrs. Dudley, who had come up with a tray of tea, at what hour the scullery chimney drew worst. On a raw night, sir, when the wind's in the north, said she readily. Then it moans like a child what's lost, and I do say my prayers. Prudence is its own reward, said Holmes gravely, and followed Lestrade to the door. A thin rain had begun to drift. Holmes stood bareheaded upon the step and sniffed, not at the weather, but, as it seemed to me, at the very brickwork. He went down the few steps to the area, examined the iron grating which admitted air to the basement, and then stood motionless, the forefinger of his right hand extended like one who points a moral for himself. "You see, Lestrade," he said. "I see a grating, Mr. Holmes." "And mud," Holmes murmured. "Mud with two histories. This, which is ordinary London, yellow with the grit of pulverized granite, and this, a lighter, chalkier smear with an admixture of hairline plaster. We shall meet it again, I fancy? Come, one more glance at the study and I am done for the present." Back within, he passed the hearth without looking at it, and went straight to the door. Bending, he measured, with that same eye of his which was as accurate as any rule, the distance from the floor to the lower rim of the keyhole, and from that to the little pencil mark he had made upon the skirting above. He smiled. Oh, it was the faintest movement, the mere ghost of amusement. "Watson," he said, "it is always a pleasure to meet an old friend in a new coat. We have, I think, the makings of our case. This house is full of voices, and some of them are not to be trusted. We will leave them to talk to one another for an hour. I must ask Mrs. Winterbourne's permission to order certain small arrangements, after which, with the inspector's goodwill, I propose to set a little engine going and to see who comes to oil it." He would say no more, though I plied him with questions. Yet, as we left the study, he paused one instant to look again at the fender, and his long finger hovered in the air an inch above that grey bloom of ash. "Not yet," he repeated very softly, echoing, whether he knew it or not, the dreadful phrase we had heard. "Not yet." But soon Holmes was never one to prolong suspense when the ground beneath his feet had begun to yield a little of its secret, yet on this occasion he maintained a composure so deliberate that even I, accustomed as I was to his methods, found my patience sorely tried. We had returned to the drawing-room, where Mrs. Winterbourne and her sister awaited us, and there Holmes busied himself with the fire-irons, brushing an imaginary speck of ash from the poker, as though we had not just heard a voice whisper through the boards above our heads. "Madam," he said at last, turning with that air of quiet authority which seemed to banish hysteria from a room, "you must not suppose the phenomena of last night or this evening to be beyond human agency. A voice travels curiously in certain conditions, and wood, like stone, has its chambers and conduits. That your household heard what it did is not in question. The matter to determine is whose voice and to what purpose." Her eyes widened. "You believe it no spirit, then?" "Spirits, Mrs. Winterbourne, have the singular defect of leaving no trace. Our whisper, on the contrary, leaves behind ashes, plaster, and plaster dust upon boots. No ghost I know is so material." His tone was brisk but not unkind. "Now I must ask you for a list, as precise as you can manage, of those present in this house at the time of Mr. Deacon's death. Begin with yourself, your sister, your nurse, Miss Vale, and Mr. Deacon. Who else set foot in the study that day?" She named Jonah, who had admitted Mr. Deacon, and Mrs. Dudley, who had carried tea into the drawing-room earlier. The housemaid, Alice, had been dismissed a fortnight before and had not returned. Holmes nodded, though I could see by the faint gleam in his eye that the mention of Alice interested him particularly. "Did she go quietly?" he asked. "Or was there resentment?" "Resentment, yes," Miss Harrow interposed crisply. "The girl was impertinent, as Lydia told you, and sullen. When she left, she declared she would have her due, though what she meant I cannot say." Holmes rubbed his hands softly together. "Excellent. It is a rule with me, Mrs. Winterbourne, that every dismissed servant leaves behind them a shadow, and sometimes a very solid one. If Alice be innocent, she will bear our scrutiny without harm. If not, well, shadows deepen in proportion to the light we throw. Watson, kindly make a note of her name and her last address, if it is known." Miss Vale, who had been silent, now burst out with an earnestness which shook her customary composure. "But what of Mr. Deacon? Are we to believe he died by accident, by some seizure of the heart? His face, oh, I cannot forget it, was not the face of a man who dies peacefully." Holmes fixed her with that keen gaze which compels a truthful answer before the question is put. "And what do you recall, Miss Vale, of his appearance?" The more minute, the better she trembled, but responded. "He lay half upon his side, one arm outstretched. His lips were drawn back, as though in pain or surprise. His skin was grey. I thought his eyes were wider than they should have been, as if he stared at something dreadful." "Thank you," said Holmes simply. He did not comment further, but I knew that her words had struck home. I could see it in the way his fingers traced the edge of his notebook, tapping once, twice, as if confirming a calculation. At this juncture, Lestrade, who had followed us in, could hold his tongue no longer. "All very pretty, Mr. Holmes. You may spin your theories about plaster and whispers, but the medical officer's report is plain enough. Death by syncope due to sudden failure of the heart. The man had no wound, no poison detected in the mouth. The case is closed, save for the missing will, which was likely burned by mistake." Holmes turned to him with that gentle courtesy which he reserved for the moments when he was about to contradict someone completely. "You are right, Inspector, that a heart may fail suddenly. You are right also that the absence of a wound narrows our field. But you forget that not all poisons declare themselves to the tongue. Some have their entry by subtler means. And when we consider that a document, sealed with blue wax, has been subjected to fire in that same hearth, Lestrade, does it not suggest to you that the fire may have served more than one purpose?" Lestrade's frown deepened, but he made no reply. Holmes, without waiting for one, turned abruptly back to Mrs. Winterbourne. "You have a son, madam." "Was he in the nursery throughout the evening?" "Yes, save when Miss Vale carried him down after the first whisper frightened us." "And the safe?" Holmes pressed on. "Its contents, apart from the will, are they of value?" She shook her head. "Only household papers and Arthur's correspondence." The will was the only document of consequence. Holmes paced once across the room, hands clasped behind his back. "I have seen him so many times in that attitude," leaning slightly forward, as though his thoughts marched in cadence with his steps, "that it has come to mean for me the surest prelude to discovery." He stopped suddenly and turned upon Jonah, who had hovered near the doorway throughout. "You were once a mason, Jonah?" the man started. "Why, yes, sir, afore I took service." "How did you—" "Your boots, my good fellow, speak louder than your tongue. You have been about plaster and lime, and recently. Was it here, in this house?" Jonah's jaw tightened. "In the cellar, sir. Mrs. Winterbourne had a wall patched where the damp was seeping. That was a fortnight gone." Holmes nodded. "Just so. And you recall, Watson, the gritty deposit upon the rug? A curious coincidence that the dust of plaster should rise from a floor unconnected to the cellar." Jonah muttered something under his breath and withdrew. Holmes let him go without pursuit, but I noted the faint smile which played about his lips. It was then that Holmes made his proposal. "Mrs. Winterbourne, if you will grant me the liberty of your house for this evening, I should like to conduct an experiment. It may require patience on your part and courage from your servants, but I am persuaded that the whisper will return, and that when it does, it may reveal more than mere words." You mean you can draw it forth?" she whispered. Holmes bowed. "I mean that if we arrange matters with precision, the whisperer may believe himself unseen. And then—" his eyes gleamed. "Then we shall see not only what is spoken but who speaks." By tacit agreement, the rest of the day was spent in preparation. Holmes gave his instructions in that rapid, decisive manner which admitted of no debate. Lestrade, though sceptical, agreed to remain, for he was too shrewd not to sense that the case was slipping from his grasp. The household, subdued and trembling, obeyed Holmes's smallest direction. Rugs were shifted, lamps adjusted, the bell pulls tested again and again, and certain threads of wire examined with an attention which puzzled even me. Holmes asked for nothing more than silence and obedience. At dusk, the fog thickened, muffling the lamplight and turning the windows to blind mirrors. The house grew unnaturally still. Mrs. Winterbourne withdrew with her sister and Miss Vale to the drawing-room, while Holmes stationed Lestrade and myself at either end of the study. Jonah was sent ostensibly upon an errand, though I suspected Holmes wished to remove his presence for reasons of his own. Nurse Hannah remained in the nursery with the child. Holmes himself moved restlessly between rooms, sometimes in the hall, sometimes on the stair, always listening, always watchful, like a hunter circling a covert. The hour crept toward 10, and I confess that a heaviness weighed upon me as I stood in that silent study with the fire casting long shadows upon the carpet where Deacon had lain. Suddenly through the hush it came again, the whisper. Low, deliberate, unearthly in its modulation. "Not yet." "Wait," I started violently, though I had steeled myself for it. Lestrade swore under his breath. Holmes, who had been standing at the foot of the stair, was upon his knees in an instant, his ear pressed to the skirting, his hand upon that peculiar bell wire with the leather sleeve. He gave a sharp tug, released it, then straightened, his face alight. "The trap is ready," he murmured. "Watson, remain where you are. The whisperer will speak again, and when he does, I think he may betray more than he intends, for the voice we hear is not an echo of the dead, but the living tongue of a very cunning rogue, and he cannot long resist his own device." The whisper came once more, lingering, almost gloating. "Wait." "Not yet." Holmes's hand shot out, grasped the leather-sleeved wire, and with a swift wrench tore it free. A sharp cry followed, muffled yet unmistakably human, from somewhere beneath our feet. The whole household seemed to shudder at that cry. Holmes leapt to the door, his eyes blazing. "Come, Watson!" The cellar. The whisper has found its own tongue at last. Down the narrow stair we went, Holmes in the lead, his lantern beam cutting through the chill vapour that clung about the lower passages. Lestrade pressed close at his heels, revolver in hand, while I followed with a quickened pulse that told of both fear and anticipation. From somewhere beneath the house there came a scuffling sound, then silence, then the hollow reverberation of a footfall, as though someone had stumbled upon stone. Holmes moved with the noiseless certainty of a cat. The rest of us, clumsier, betrayed our presence with creaks of the stair and the echo of boots upon flagstone. The cellar was a broad chamber with arched brickwork and walls mottled by damp. A rank smell of earth and lime rose from one corner where repairs had lately been made. Against the far wall stood a stack of coal, black and glistening, beside it a pile of timber. At first it appeared empty. Then, as Holmes swung the lantern, its light fell upon a figure crouched near the patched wall, his hand clutched about a coil of wire that disappeared into a crevice. It was Jonah. His face, when the light struck it, was ghastly pale beneath the grime, his eyes starting like those of a hunted animal. With a hoarse cry, he dropped the wire and made a lunge for the stair, but Lestrade was upon him in an instant, and between us we dragged him back into the circle of light. Holmes stooped and gathered up the coil, examining its end. "Leather sleeve to deaden friction," he muttered. "The wire passes upward through the joists to the nursery floor." A clever arrangement, and one that could not have been contrived without knowledge of the house's bones. Jonah struggled in our grasp. "I did naught." "I swear it. It were only a game." Holmes's voice cut him short. "A game whose rules are written in ash and plaster dust, my good fellow. We have heard your whisper, and the house has heard it too. You had best answer plainly, or Scotland Yard shall wring the truth out of you." At this, Lestrade tightened his grip and shook the man until his teeth rattled. "Out with it, Jonah! What trick is this with your wires and your whispers, and what of Mr. Deacon's death?" The fellow's resistance collapsed. He sagged like a sack between us, muttering incoherently. Holmes raised a hand to silence Lestrade's impatient questions. "Leave him a moment. He will speak more when he has gauged that silence is of no avail." Sure enough, after a minute, Jonah lifted his head, his lips trembling. "I were paid, sir. Paid only to set the thing up, not to harm a soul. A gentleman come to me, said he wanted to frighten the mistress a little, make her think the place haunted. He gave me gold, more than a month's wages, to run the wire from this place to the nursery. He told me the words to whisper. That's all I know as I stand before you." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And this gentleman's name?" "I never knew it, sir. He wore a cloak and hat, and he met me twice. Once in a tavern by Bloomsbury, once here, when he gave me the wire. But I swear I never laid hand on Mr. Deacon. When I found him dead, Lord help me, I thought the ghost had turned true." The man's terror was convincing enough to shake even Lestrade's certainty. Yet Holmes, who never judged by appearances alone, studied him with the air of one weighing metal upon a balance. "You may not have struck the blow, Jonah," he said at last, "but your contrivance was the cloak beneath which another moved. If you wish to save yourself, you will tell me everything you recall of this patron, his voice, his stature, any gesture or word that clings to memory." Jonah wrung his hands. He were tall, thin, spoke soft but quick, like one in a hurry. He knew the house, right enough. He said the lady kept papers in the safe that might concern others beside herself. He gave me the words to speak. "Not yet. Wait." He said those would chill her blood. Holmes's eyes narrowed. "And the day Mr. Deacon died, you were in the house?" "Aye, sir. I let the gentleman in myself. He told me he'd business with the master's papers, and that I should see to my work below. I never thought it wicked until I heard the scream from above." The inspector gave a grunt of satisfaction. "So? We have our intruder, Mr. Holmes. The fellow comes by arrangement with this dolt, steals the will, and leaves Deacon dead. The case is as plain as daylight." Holmes shook his head slowly. "Plain, Lestrade? I think the daylight here is still fogged. Consider, the study door was locked from within. The key remained in the lock. The window was barred. How, then, did your mysterious gentleman quit the room? Jonah, did you see him depart?" "No, sir. I swear it. When the constable came, I was still in the cellar." Holmes's tone grew cold. "Then you have lied, or else your patron was no ordinary thief." "Enough. We shall let Lestrade's men hold you for the present. Watson, note well that our problem is not simplified, but rather deepened. The whisper was but a curtain. Behind it stands a hand, skilled enough to take life and vanish as though through solid walls." Jonah was secured, protesting his innocence, while Holmes examined the patched portion of the wall. He tapped along its surface with his knuckles, pausing where the sound changed from solid to hollow. With sudden energy, he drew a chisel from the man's discarded tools and scraped at the mortar. A thin trickle of plaster dust fell to the ground. "You observe, Watson," he said softly, "that our mason's recent work masks a cavity, not large but sufficient to conceal something hastily thrust within. Let us see a few deft strokes and a brick loosened." Holmes thrust in his long arm and withdrew a small packet, blackened at one end as though by fire. He unwrapped the outer cloth and disclosed a roll of papers tied with tape. The outermost was scorched and smeared with wax. Mrs. Winterbourne's cry rang out from behind us, for she had followed in despite her terror. "Arthur's will!" she gasped. "It is the very packet!" Holmes held it up to the lantern light, his expression unreadable. So the will was not consumed in the fire after all. Yet someone sought to make it appear so. And why conceal it here, in the cellar wall, unless the thief were interrupted and dared not carry it away? Lestrade, we grow closer to our phantom, though he still slips between our fingers. The inspector seized the packet eagerly, declaring he would have it examined at once. But Holmes detained him with a hand upon his arm. "No, my dear fellow. Until we know whose hand placed it here, the will must remain in this house under guard, otherwise we risk alerting our quarry that his game is up. Better to let him think the deception still holds," Lestrade grumbled, but yielded. Holmes replaced the packet in his pocket with care, then turned to Mrs. Winterbourne. "You must hold your courage, madam. Your house has played host to a very cunning scheme, but its actors have left their footprints. I propose that we set a final snare tonight, one that will draw our whisperer into the open. Will you lend me the use of your drawing-room and your presence, as though nothing were amiss?" She inclined her head bravely, though her lips trembled. "If it will end this."
"Nightmare, Mr. Holmes, I will do whatever you ask." Holmes gave a curt nod. "Then so be it. Lestrade, keep Jonah secure, but within earshot. His terror may prove of use. Watson, we shall sit with the ladies as though in conversation, while our ghost, believing the house asleep, may return to seek what he lost. For I tell you, the man who devised this stratagem will not rest while that packet lies beyond his grasp. We must make him come for it, and when he does, the floorboards of Montague Street shall yield us not a whisper, but the voice of truth." So it was agreed, and as we ascended once more to the lighted rooms above, the fog pressing at the windows seemed less oppressive than the weight of suspense that hung within those walls. For the trap was set, and we waited only for the night to grow deeper, when the whisperer would come again, and, this time, be heard. The hours that followed were of a kind which impressed themselves upon the memory by the sheer tension of silence. We had returned to the drawing-room, where the lamps burned with a steady glow and the curtains were drawn against the fog. Mrs. Winterbourne, pale but composed, sat with her sister and Miss Vale, while Holmes maintained a posture of apparent ease upon the settee, his long legs stretched toward the fire, his fingers idly turning the pages of a book he could not possibly have read. Lestrade, restless and mistrustful of any method but his own, paced from window to hearth and back again, now glancing at the clock, now at the door which led toward the hall. For myself, I tried to maintain some appearance of calm, but my nerves betrayed me each time the coals shifted or the wood cracked in the grate. Holmes alone seemed impervious to the strain. Yet I, who knew his habits, saw the signs of his concentrated alertness in the way his eyelids drooped, in the faint twitch of one hand upon the book's binding, and in the sudden, hawk-like gleam when the faintest sound reached him. He was listening, not to the drawing-room, but to the entire house, as if the walls themselves might whisper their secrets if one were keen enough to hear. At 10:30, the first note of disturbance sounded. From the passage came the muffled tread of heavy boots, followed by a low exchange of voices. Lestrade moved to the door, but Holmes raised a hand. "Leave them, Inspector. That is only your constable changing his watch with Jonah's guard. It is well that the man should think himself under no undue suspicion." A few minutes later, Holmes closed his book and rose. He crossed to the escritoire, opened a drawer, and with the most deliberate air drew forth a packet which all in the room recognized. He placed it upon the mantel beneath the clock in full view of the company. Mrs. Winterbourne uttered a soft protest, but he silenced her with a glance. "Better that it stand baited," he murmured, "than that the rat grow cautious. The one who sought it will not believe it safe until it is again in his hand. If he sees it plainly before him yet cannot take it, we shall learn more in an hour than we could in a month of surmise." The hands of the clock crawled toward 11. The ladies spoke now and then in low voices, but their words carried the strained note of those who seek to mask their anxiety. Lestrade's pacing grew more abrupt. I confess that more than once I found myself staring at the mantel, half expecting to see the packet vanish before my eyes. It was not until a little before midnight that the true drama began. A faint creak sounded above our heads, followed by the muffled vibration of some weight upon the upper floor. Miss Vale clutched Mrs. Winterbourne's hand. Miss Harrow sat bolt upright. Lestrade darted a glance at Holmes, but the latter merely inclined his head toward the ceiling. "Patience," he whispered. "The stage is setting itself." The sound came again, this time closer, then died away. For a quarter of an hour we heard nothing, and even Lestrade began to mutter of wasted time. But Holmes had moved to the corner near the door, his back to the shadows, his gaze fixed upon the mantel. I recognized the attitude, alert, ready, his mind fixed upon a single point. Then, with a suddenness that made every heart leap, the whisper came once more. Clearer now, more insistent, it stole through the very floorboards beneath us. "Not yet. Wait." The effect upon the ladies was immediate. Miss Vale gasped aloud, Mrs. Winterbourne half rose from her chair, and even Miss Harrow pressed a hand to her lips. Lestrade swore under his breath and made to rush into the hall, but Holmes was swifter. With a bound he was at the mantel, his hand upon the packet. At that instant a thin black rod emerged, snake-like, from the narrow crevice between wall and wainscot. It quivered, extended, and with the most delicate motion began to inch toward the papers. "Now, Watson!" Holmes cried. I sprang forward, but Holmes was already upon the rod, gripping it in his lean fingers. He gave a violent wrench, and from the opposite side of the wall came a strangled cry. In another moment the rod was dragged through the gap, and attached to its end was a pair of slender steel tongs, cunningly contrived to clutch and withdraw a paper without disturbing so much as the dust of the mantel. The cry was repeated, this time followed by the rush of retreating footsteps within the wall itself. Lestrade stared in amazement. "The wall! By heaven, he's in the wall!" "Follow!" Holmes commanded, already darting into the hall. We tore after him, down the passage and toward the rear of the house, where a panel had been left ajar. Through it we glimpsed a narrow cavity running between the walls, just wide enough for a man to squeeze along. The lantern's beam caught a flurry of plaster dust and the trailing edge of a cloak vanishing round a corner. Holmes plunged in without hesitation, Lestrade at his heels, and I followed, the
confined space choking us with stale air and the rasp of our own pursuit. The passage turned sharply and descended by a rough stair of stone, leading toward the very cellars we had quitted earlier. We heard the fugitive stumble, recover, then dash forward again with desperate speed. At the foot of the stair the way opened into the same cellar chamber, but the man had anticipated us. He darted toward the coal stack, seized a hidden latch, and flung open a small door cunningly built into the brickwork. Before he could slip through, Holmes hurled himself forward and seized the cloak. There was a brief, furious struggle, the lantern swinging wildly, shadows leaping upon the walls. Then, with Lestrade's aid, the intruder was dragged into the open and pinned against the wall. The lantern showed us the face of Henry Deacon. For a moment, none of us spoke. Mrs. Winterbourne's solicitor, the man we had found lying dead upon the hearth-rug, glared at us with eyes full of rage and fear. His lips were flecked with foam, his breath came in ragged gasps. Lestrade stared in stupefaction. "But he was dead!" I exclaimed involuntarily. We all saw him, his pallor, his stillness. Holmes's voice cut through the tumult, calm but edged with triumph. Dead, Watson. Number. Only rendered so in semblance. A drug, no doubt, something to still the pulse and chill the skin. A stratagem to remove suspicion while his accomplice concealed the will. He feigned death until it was safe to revive and resume his plot. I knew from the first that no heart fails with such convenient timing. Deacon spat an oath, but Holmes silenced him with a gesture. You overreached yourself with your whispers, sir. Had you been content to vanish, your ruse might have passed. But to terrify a household with your ventriloquism of wires and bell-pulls, there you revealed the hand of the schemer who delights too much in his own ingenuity. Lestrade, recovering his voice, clapped irons upon the prisoner. By heaven, Mr. Holmes, I shall never doubt you again. To think I would have signed this man's death certificate. He'll have his chance to explain before the magistrate. Holmes examined the man coolly. He will explain much, I fancy, the missing funds of his clients, the forgeries which a too curious will might have exposed, the necessity of silencing any who stood between him and his designs. Yes, Inspector, I think you will find a net of crime tangled about Mr. Deacon's person, of which this affair of the whisper is but a single strand. The captive was led away, struggling and cursing, while the ladies, pale and trembling, were comforted as best we could manage. Holmes, however, showed no exultation. He stood by the hearth, the steel tongs still in his hand, and regarded them with a kind of disdain. A clever device, Watson, he murmured. But cleverness unguided by wisdom is ever the architect of its own ruin. You see how our whisper, meant to awe, became instead the rope by which he hanged himself. I could not but marvel at the chain of reasoning that had led him from ashes and plaster dust to so extraordinary a revelation. Yet I knew, even as I watched him, that the case was not wholly ended, for Holmes's eyes still gleamed with that peculiar light which told me his mind had further depths to plumb, and that some final explanation yet awaited the light of day. The arrest of Henry Deacon might have seemed the natural conclusion to all who were not accustomed to the subtler workings of my friend's mind. Lestrade, flushed with triumph, had departed in haste with his prisoner under heavy guard, and Mrs. Winterbourne, her ordeal seemingly ended, withdrew upstairs with her sister and Miss Vale to compose her child for the night. The house, which had throbbed with such dreadful expectancy, grew still again. Yet I, who had stood beside Holmes in many a closing scene, knew by the set of his shoulders and the glitter still burning in his eyes that he was not content. We sat alone in the study, the lantern upon the table casting sharp light upon the packet of papers Holmes had reclaimed. He had untied the tape and spread the documents with the meticulous care of a physician examining a patient. I leaned forward, eager to see what could so occupy him when the villain lay already in custody. You observed, Watson, he said without looking up, that our solicitor showed the world a most convincing mask of death, only to rise from his bier like Lazarus. A trick of chemistry, certainly, but the more dangerous mask lies here. He tapped the open will with a long finger. This paper was the true object of the crime, and until we know what it contains, we can not say for whom the whisper was uttered or whose fortune trembled in the balance. I bent to examine the will. It was a straightforward enough document, leaving the bulk of Arthur Winterbourne's estate to his widow and son, with small legacies to his sister-in-law and a few charities. Yet as I read, Holmes's thin lips curved in a smile that chilled me. Straightforward, Watson? Then why should a man risk life, liberty, and reputation to destroy or conceal it? Look more closely I did so, but saw nothing amiss beyond the formal language and legal attestation. I see nothing. Precisely. You see nothing because you look for none. But notice the ink upon this clause. To my beloved son, Thomas Winterbourne, I leave the residue of my estate. The hand falters ever so slightly as though the pen were held by one unused to the style. Compare it with the line above, which is smooth and even. And here, the final signature of the witnesses. The strokes are of two different inks, one black, the other a trifle bluer. Our late Mr. Deacon has been at work upon this document, altering it to suit his own ends. I stared in astonishment. But why conceal rather than keep it? If he had forged a clause in his own favour. Ah, but he did not mean to benefit openly. That would be too crude, too direct. No, Watson, his art lay in destroying the original and substituting one more advantageous to an accomplice. Consider, he arranged for the will to vanish in the flames. Meanwhile, a forged copy, doubtless prepared, would later appear, validated by his own testimony as solicitor. Thus the estate might pass, not to the rightful heir, but to another. And who that other may be, well, therein lies our true mystery. The thought staggered me, but Holmes, Deacon is in custody. Surely he cannot carry out such a plot now. Holmes's eyes gleamed. He cannot, but the accomplice remains at large. That is why I warned Lestrade not to trumpet victory too loudly. The true danger lies not in Deacon's ingenuity, but in the one who employed him. You remember Jonah's words, the patron who came in cloak and hat, who knew the house intimately. A thin man, quick of speech. That figure does not correspond with Deacon, who is stout and slow of movement. We have, then, two actors, not one. At that moment Miss Harrow re-entered, composed but grave. She thanked Holmes with quiet dignity for bringing matters to a head, but he studied her face so intently that I saw her colour rise. She asked whether she and her sister might at last rest easy. Holmes replied with a courteous bow, yet his gaze lingered after she had withdrawn. "You mark it, Watson," he murmured when the door had closed. "The play of light upon her cheek when I spoke of the accomplice." There was knowledge there, knowledge too swiftly suppressed. "You cannot mean, Miss Harrow," I cried. "Surely she has been a bulwark of strength for her sister." "Appearances deceive. It is precisely those who stand nearest that may strike the deadliest blow. She has access, she has opportunity, and, if we but knew her motive, she may have more than enough reason. We must not judge, only observe, for if my suspicion be correct, the final act of this drama is not yet played." We sat late into the night, Holmes sifting the ashes of the hearth, testing the charred scrap of wax he had pocketed earlier, and once even holding the forged will to the flame so that faint alterations in ink rose to the surface. He muttered to himself of oxalic acid, of digitalis, and of other agents that could produce the semblance of death. At last, wearied but unsatisfied, we retired. The morning brought a grey drizzle that blurred the outlines of the square and cast the house into a gloom well suited to its late events. Lestrade returned with news that Deacon, though sullen, had confessed to nothing beyond his part in concealing the will. He swore he had not altered it, and though Holmes dismissed this as a half-truth, it left us still without a clear vision of the larger scheme. Holmes insisted upon seeing Mrs. Winterbourne privately. We found her in her boudoir, her child upon her lap. She looked more composed, yet the shadow of anxiety had not lifted. Holmes spoke gently but firmly. "Madam, I must ask whether your late husband's estate might by any chance fall, failing your son, to another in your family circle." She hesitated. "Why, yes. If Thomas were to die before his majority, the property would revert to my sister Eliza by Arthur's express wish. He said she had sacrificed much for us, and he desired to secure her future." Holmes's eyes met mine with that lightning flash of triumph I knew so well. "Just so. And has your sister ever shown interest in your husband's papers, or spoken with Deacon privately?" Mrs. Winterbourne's face grew troubled. She and Mr. Deacon were often in consultation. "I thought nothing of it." "Surely, Mr. Holmes, you cannot suspect Eliza?" "I suspect no one," he replied gravely. "I only observe that the line of inheritance gives her an interest which none other can claim. And where interest lies, suspicion must at least pause to consider. She grew pale. I cannot believe it. Eliza has been my strength. Holmes bowed. Then let us prove her innocence, madam, by the simplest of means. You will invite your sister to join us presently in the study. Watson, remain with our hostess. I have one small experiment to prepare. He left us then, and when next I saw him he had contrived a little arrangement upon the mantel, the packet of papers laid open, a small file uncorked, and a strip of blotting paper close at hand. When Miss Harrow entered, calm and composed, he greeted her with grave courtesy. Miss Harrow, said he, I must trouble you to examine these documents. There is a clause here which puzzles me, and I should value your opinion. She approached without hesitation, but as her eyes fell upon the altered clause, I saw her fingers clench upon the paper and her lips compress. For one instant the mask slipped, and in that instant Holmes's hawk-like gaze missed nothing. You see the difficulty? He asked, smooth and quiet. She met his eyes steadily. I see nothing amiss. The will is as Arthur dictated it. Holmes inclined his head. Then I am satisfied. For only the forger himself could have noted the subtle difference, and your calmness assures me you are free of such guilt. She relaxed visibly, yet I knew by the faint smile upon Holmes's lips that her very effort at composure had betrayed her. When she had gone, he turned to me. Watson, the game tightens. Deacon was but the tool. The hand that moved him is within this house still. Before the day is over, I shall force that hand into the open. There was in his tone a grim resolve that sent a shiver through me. For I realized that beneath the whispers and forgeries, beneath the feigned death and the concealed will, we stood upon the edge of a revelation that might strike at the very heart of the Winterbourne household. It was close upon noon when Holmes's preparations, which to any other eye might have seemed a series of aimless trifles, began to shape themselves into a design. He bade me follow him to the study and closed the door with care. From his pocket he drew a skein of strong black silk, a length of pliant gut such as a fisherman might affect, and a pocket-knife whose back was as keen as its edge. He knelt upon the rug before the door, measured again, with that unerring eye of his, the distance from the floor to the lower rim of the keyhole, and from thence to the pencil mark he had made upon the skirting on the previous day. You remember, Watson, said he, that I spoke of meeting an old friend in a new coat? The old friend is this ancient device, by which a door may be locked from the outside, yet present every appearance of being secured within. See, a loop passed under the door, coaxed up to the key, a turn taken round the bow, a gentle pull to throw the wards, then a sharp jerk to disengage the loop. A child might do it if the measurement be exact. He slid the loop beneath the door with 2 fingers, guided it upward by the merest whisper of movement, and in 30 seconds, to my astonishment, the key wheeled obediently in its socket and clicked home. A twitch, and the silk came away as virginal as when it went in. You perceive now why the gritty triangle upon the rug lay precisely where it did, he continued. A kneeling man, intent upon his loop, brings dust from another place upon his knee. Our locked room asked for no miracle, only patience and a yard of silk. You think Deacon himself employed it? Beyond question, after he had feigned his own demise, but a tool, however ingenious, is nothing without the hand that guides it. It is that hand we must bring into the light. He took up again the packet of papers. From the drawer he produced the small file I had seen the night before, and moistened a strip of blotting paper with a few drops. Nitrate of silver, he remarked. It will leave no trace to the eye, yet where fingers that have touched it are next exposed to light, they will darken, an honest stain that no soap will efface in 24 hours. I lay it here upon the mantel, where an over-eager thief's tongs may brush it unawares. That is one snare. The other, Watson, must be laid where the game runs hottest. The nursery? The nursery, he echoed, and for an instant there was, in his keen, worn face, a hardness that chilled me. We are no longer guarding a parchment, but a child. You heard Mrs. Winterbourne. If the boy were to die before his majority, the estate passes to Miss Harrow. I do not accuse, I observe the line along which temptation might travel. We shall make it plain to the household that nurse has been sent to her sister for the afternoon, and that the child sleeps alone with a fire kept low. In truth, nurse will be within call, and I shall be nearer than any suspect dreams. He dispatched a boy to the yard with a brief note. Lestrade returned within the half-hour and received his orders without demur, for the man had learned wisdom in one hard lesson. Jonah, still in custody on the premises, was placed where he could neither stir nor signal. Mrs. Winterbourne, white but resolute, promised to keep her sister and Miss Vale with her in the drawing-room upon some pretext of signing cheques and sorting correspondence, and thus, at 3 o'clock, the house assumed the outward air of quiet domesticity, while beneath that calm a spring was wound to breaking point. Holmes vanished for a time. When he reappeared, he wore the look he has at the opera when the curtain is about to rise upon the act he has most desired to hear. "All is arranged," he said briefly. "You will take your station in the back passage, Watson, between the nursery and the stair. If any person but nurse crosses that threshold without my call, you will stay them with whatever firmness you possess. Lestrade lies in wait in the wall passage by the coal hatch to cut off retreat if our fish take the inner run. As for me, be content that I shall be within earshot. Never have I spent an hour so tautly strung." The house, muffled in drizzle, seemed to hold its breath. Now and again a coal dropped in the nursery grate with the tiniest fall of ash. Once the child stirred and uttered that small, heartbreaking moan which sleeping infants give. Each time my hand went to the knob, each time I checked myself and counted my pulses till steadiness returned. From below there came the murmur of women's voices and Lestrade's heavy shoe somewhere in the entrails of the house, but above all there was that watchful silence which Holmes's presence creates as a field of force around him. It must have been a little after 4 when the current changed. A floorboard, 2 rooms distant, gave the faintest complaint. A door eased upon its hinge, so gently that only a man who has learned to hear with the whole surface of his body would have picked it up. I set my back to the nursery door and waited. A shadow detached itself from the dimness at the far end of the corridor and came on with the soft speed of one who knows every creak and notch. It paused once, listening. Then, with a movement at once deliberate and furtive, it approached the door opposite mine, the nursery. The hand that came out of the gloom was gloved. Between finger and palm it held a small flask, stoppered with wax. "Not yet," said a voice at my very ear, Holmes's voice, low and cutting, and his long arm slid past me like a rapier, his hand closing upon the intruder's wrist with a grip that bit to the bone. "If you will be so good as to step within, quietly, it is time our whisper learned a different answer." The figure recoiled, then yielded. We edged into the room together. The child slept on, rosy and unconscious, the small breath like a tide upon a shell. Holmes, without once loosening his hold, reached with the other hand and drew the curtain wider. The grey light fell upon the intruder's face. It was Miss Harrow. She was very composed. Only the pulse in her throat, beating against the collar of her gown, betrayed her. The wax-stoppered phial glimmered dully between Holmes's fingers and her own. "For your sister's draught," she said evenly. "She has not slept." I thought if the child stirred, a little laudanum upon his pillow might quiet him. Nurse was not here, nor was she sent for. Holmes returned. And laudanum, administered to an infant, is as likely to still the breath as the crying. Pray spare us phrases, Miss Harrow. Tell us, instead, how many consultations you held with Mr. Deacon, in which this child's future was the principal topic. She looked him full in the face. "As many as were proper in arranging my sister's affairs." "Ah, and the rod and tongs that sought the packet upon the mantel, were they proper too? The leather-sleeved wire from the cellar? The key turned from without? No, do not struggle, Lestrade! At the call, the inspector burst from the wall passage, dust-white and triumphant. In his hand he held a pair of slender tongs whose tips and hinges were stained a curious faint brown. "Brushed your devil's blotting, Mr. Holmes," he reported, with savage satisfaction. "Give us sunlight, and the mark will blossom." Holmes's voice, when he spoke, had lost all colour. "Eliza Harrow, I arrest you in the name of the law for conspiracy and attempted murder. You have loved your sister, perhaps, after your fashion, but you have loved security more. You and Deacon, between you, forged and hid a will. You contrived a ghost to unnerve a household. And when your tool failed, and the paper slipped beyond your grasp, you turned where such schemers always turn, upon the small life that stood between you and your desire. Be thankful the door you found shut today had a watcher behind it. For one instant her self-command failed. A terrible look, rage, scorn, and some darker passion I could not read, swept across her features. Then it was gone. She stood quite still, while Lestrade, none too gently, took the file and the neat, murderous little scissors that peeped from her sleeve, and laid his hand upon her arm. Holmes bent, touched the sleeping child's hair with a tenderness that moved me strangely and drew me back toward the door. "Come, Watson," said he very softly. "We have saved a life. There remains only to explain how the dead rose and how the living contrived to speak from boards. After that, London may mutter as it pleases." The arrest itself was but the prelude to a scene which, I confess, tried my nerves more than any pursuit through fog or grapple in a cellar. Holmes would not permit Lestrade to remove Miss Harrow at once. He desired first that all the threads be placed upon the table where even the dullest eye could follow their interlacement. Accordingly, we returned to the study where Mrs. Winterbourne, summoned by nurse, came trembling yet upright, her child safe and rosy on the woman's arm. Miss Vale hovered near the door, white with indignation and pity in equal measure. Lestrade, hard as a truncheon in his manner, stationed himself behind the prisoner's chair. Holmes remained standing, long and spare, one hand upon the mantel where the bait had lain. "You shall not shame me with a theatre," Miss Harrow said quietly. "If I must hear your accusations, say them and be done." "It is precisely because I would spare you the theatre," Holmes returned, "that I prefer daylight to whispers. Let us begin where your whispers began, under the nursery floor. Jonah, bring up your coil." The man, cowed and manacled, was fetched to the threshold. At Holmes's nod he produced the wire we had found, and the leather-sleeved length that had passed through the joists. Holmes knelt, lifted with a penknife the very board Jonah had once prized up, and showed us, set cunningly in the hollow, a tiny wooden cup covered by a film that shone faintly in the lamplight. "A resonator," he said. "A child's toy to any man who has dabbled in acoustics. A speaking drum. A scrap of gut stretched across a shallow, the edges sealed with wax and shellac. Here," he touched the rim, "are the traces, the blue from sealing wax which I found charred upon your fender, and the brown flake of varnish out of which this film was made. The leather sleeve upon the bell wire, where it enters the floor, damps stray vibration and carries the motion cleanly to the drum. A whisper, spoken in the cavity behind the skirting, or, better, in the cool throat of the cellar, where sound travels like water in a pipe, sets this membrane quivering and gives back, upstairs, that unearthly murmur which frightened your house. You, Miss Harrow, took care the words were such as to unnerve. Not yet. Wait. A woman's counsel to herself, perhaps? Her hands, which had lain so calmly in her lap, closed until the knuckles made white caps upon the skin. "And what of Mr. Deacon?" she said. "Will you tell my sister that I killed him too?" Holmes's glance did not soften. Mr. Deacon killed nothing but his own reputation. He entered this room at 8, took from the drawer the key to the study, and made a pretty scene of sudden death by chloral to quiet his movements and a dose of digitalis to throw the pulse so low that a hasty hand would read it as still. He lay where you found him, half upon the rug, the fender close at hand. Presently, when the household had scattered and you, Miss Harrow, were upstairs attending to the terror you had contrived, he rose, warmed the packet at the coals to blister the blue wax. He held up the blackened fragment, and singed the outer leaf to suggest destruction. He then hid the true will in the cellar wall, where Jonah's new mortar would mask the cavity. Lestrade grunted. And the door, Mr. Holmes? Holmes smiled that thin smile which is not mirth, but the drawing together of chords when the bow is in tune. Our locked room was locked from without. He showed us then, with his silk and gut, the trick he had demonstrated to me an hour before, how the loop, coaxed under the door and cast about the keybow, can, by a delicate pull, turn the wards and click the lock, and then, by a jerk, flit back like a spider's thread. Deacon, knowing the measurement to a hair, knelt thus, bringing with him the smear of gritty plaster from below which I found upon the nap of the carpet, and made the door secure. He then slipped by the secret way between the walls to the cellar and waited for the hue and cry to spend itself. Later he ventured up by night to recover the packet by means of these tongs. He indicated the steel contrivance Lestrade had seized, but found to his cost that not all bait lies idle. He brushed my little strip of silver nitrate in passing, and before morning the stain would have bloomed upon his fingers like confession. Miss Vale gave a little cry. But why? Why all this mummery of death and voices? Because, Holmes answered, a forged will cannot be read without danger unless the original has indisputably perished, and because, when the original proved more troublesome than he had reckoned, Mr. Deacon meant to bring forward a second testament, drawn by his hand, witnessed by his creatures, in which the residue, failing the child, would go to a person he could control. He turned to Mrs. Winterbourne, and in his voice there was, for the first time that day, a note of gentleness. Madam, when your husband declared that the estate should revert to Miss Harrow if your son died before his majority, he gave your sister, already dependent upon your bounty, the strongest temptation the world can offer to a passionate and embittered nature, the promise of safety purchased cheaply, as such minds count, cost Miss Harrow's lips moved. When the words came, they were steady. You speak of embitterment, Mr. Holmes. You have perhaps never watched a woman yield her youth to a house not her own, to soothe the child that is not hers, to manage the books and the tradesmen while the widow is comforted for her loss, to hear, even from the dead man's friends, that she has been handsomely provided for, when in truth she is beholden for every cup of tea she drinks. I did not plan murder. I meant to put the paper where, when it was read, the world would say, "This is just." The whisper, yes, was foolish. It seemed to me a harmless instrument. When your interference robbed Henry of his part, the steadiness broke. I did not mean to hurt him. Only a drop upon the pillow to keep him sleeping. Only... She could not finish. Holmes's face did not change, yet I, who know its smallest muscles, felt that some string in him vibrated to that mingled pride and misery. I do not judge your feelings, Miss Harrow. I state your acts. The law will do the rest, and it is capable, within its limits, of mercy where a life has not been taken. As for Mr. Deacon, his account will be longer. Mrs. Winterbourne had covered her face. Miss Vale's arm was about her. For an instant the room held only the soft breathing of the child in the nurse's arms and the rhythm of rain upon the shutter. Then Lestrade cleared his throat, uncomfortable in the presence of tears, and jerked his head toward the door. "You've heard enough, ma'am." "We must be about our duty." He turned to Holmes. "And you, sir, if you would be so good as to set down your statement for the magistrate, you shall have my gratitude. No more than that, the yard's gratitude, though it goes sore against the grain to say it." Holmes inclined his head, already far away, upon some last point of method. In one moment, Inspector. There remains a trifle which has amused me. He crossed to the mantel, where the key of the study still depended in the inner lock, and to the door, where his pencil mark showed faint upon the skirting. You see, Watson, how neat a circle the facts make when once one has the measure? The plaster upon the rug, the bead of varnish, the blistered wax, the chimney's voice, the silk loop, the child's inheritance. Each is a word. Together they make a sentence so legible that even our friend from Scotland Yard, he bowed slightly toward Lestrade, may read it without a lens. Lestrade snorted, but there was no malice in it. I'll read it, Mr. Holmes, and I'll sign it twice over. Come, Miss Harrow. She rose. For the first time she looked not at Holmes, but at her sister. Some change, small but profound, passed between them, too private for my pen. Then she turned and went out between Lestrade and his man with a step that neither hurried nor dragged. When the door had closed, Mrs. Winterbourne raised her head. "Mr. Holmes," she said very low, "you have saved my child and my reason. How one thanks a man for that I do not know." Holmes's long hand made a quick, deprecating motion. "Pray do not thank me. Thank rather the obstinacy of facts, which have a way of presenting themselves to anyone who will stoop to pick them up." He looked not at the mother, but at the sleeping boy, and a curious softness touched his austere features. "Let him keep his sleep, nurse. London is loud enough when one grows tall." We left them thus, and as we stepped once more into the fog that pressed upon Montague Street, Holmes drew his coat close and tilted his chin to the sour wind. "There will be a paragraph in the evening papers," he observed, "about a solicitor unmasked and a family ghost laid by the heels. It will be wrong in every particular, of course, but what would you? It is the way of London to mutter one thing when it means another. We breakfasted late, for the fog had thickened with the morning, and there is in such weather a lethargy which sits even upon Baker Street. Holmes, who had eaten nothing the night before, took his coffee black and his egg untasted, his gaze upon the fire, and his violin under one hand, as if the instrument, like an old hound, must feel the touch to know its master was safe. The afternoon editions had already begun their conjectures: ghost laid in Montague Street, solicitor's sudden death a fraud, and one very confident column which married both falsehoods into a romance of spiritualism and secret societies. Holmes read the last with a glint of amusement, folded it, and thrust it beneath the coal scuttle. "You are not moved to correct them?" I asked. "My dear fellow," said he, "were I to wrestle every newspaper from its fantasies, I should have no time for facts. Besides, our friends at the Yard will prefer the laurel to grow upon their own ground." There came, as if in answer, a brisk rap upon the door and a note in Lestrade's crabbed hand. Holmes broke the seal and passed it to me. The inspector wrote that Deacon had slept the night in a cell, had waked protesting, and had found, to his astonishment and Lestrade's contentment, that the skin of the forefinger and thumb of his right hand had darkened to a dingy black, a stain he attributed at first to ink, but which soap and sand could not remove. "Your devil's trick," added Lestrade, not without grudging admiration, "has turned a thief's tongs into a witness with a better memory than most constables." He further reported that a second testament, drawn a fortnight since and witnessed by 2 clerks in Deacon's pay, had been discovered at the man's chambers, naming, as residuary legatee failing the child, a lady of our acquaintance. "We have the clerks," the letter concluded, "and they are already desirous of unburdening themselves." Holmes's fingers drummed once upon the bridge of the violin. "It is neatly tied, is it not? When greed works with fear, one may always expect a double knot." "You were certain of the stain?" I asked. "As certain as one may be of the sun in London," said he dryly. "Silver salts are faithful servants. A brush against that doctored blotter, a night's exposure, and the pattern blossoms like moss upon a stone. Had Deacon reached the packet last evening, we should have read the mark upon his fingers without the necessity of the wall passage. As it is, Lestrade has both. I could not rest until I had the whole chain from his lips, link by link. He indulged me, as he often did in those calmer hours when the hunt was done. "The first oddity," said he, "was not the whisper, but where it was heard. Your voice from the study rose distinctly to the nursery. Nurse heard you and could repeat your words. But my calls from above were not returned to our ears below. That asymmetry speaks of a membrane, something that accepts vibration from one side and gives it out upon the other, but is so placed that the converse experiment fails. The leather sleeve upon the bell wire where it enters the floor was the second oddity. Workmen are not sentimental. They sleeve when friction offends them. Here the sleeve damped all but the chosen vibration, and the little rosette of plaster about the entry was more rubbed than its neighbours. Add to this the gritty triangle upon the rug, plaster upon the knee of a man who had knelt to play his loop under the study door, and the course of our ghost lay as plain as a parish map. The fender gave me Deacon. There was a bead of brown varnish caught in the hinge, a blue smear of melted sealing wax among the ashes, and a smooth, deliberate heat mark where a packet had been warmed, not singed. Deacon is a methodical creature. He would blister the wax rather than break it, to preserve the impression, if only in part, against later use. A hasty thief burns, a careful rogue blisters. Observe, too, the open safe in a room where everything else spoke of scruple. Our lady of the house would not leave it so. Deacon would, when he desired to suggest mischance rather than theft. Then the locked room, a new escutcheon about a door forced outward by our honest constable, a key left within, and on the skirting my pencil mark, just where a silk loop, dragged free, must fall if the measurement were exact. That is the old friend in his new coat. As to Deacon's death, no death at all. There is a smell that chloral leaves upon a man's breath, and a laxity about the jaw which belongs more to sleep than to the last sleep. Our medical officer was content with a chill skin and a low pulse, but there is a quality in the eye after death which no drug mimics to a practised observer. I would not swear by it in a court. I trust it in a drawing-room. Add his admirable timing, his convenient posture toward the fender, and his client's vanished will, and I was prepared to treat Mr. Deacon as a living man, feigning the opposite until fact forbade me. "And Miss Harrow?" I asked quietly. "Ah!" He set the violin aside and took his pipe. "Motive is the lodestar. You heard the clause, you saw her face. She is a woman of iron habits, competent to a fault, but with pride for mortar and loneliness for stone. Such natures will suffer for years and then move, when they move at all, like an avalanche. She had opportunity to command Jonah, access to every stair and cupboard, and a temper which, if once convinced that she was correcting a wrong, would drift very near to crime while still speaking the language of duty. The whisper she chose was not hush or go, but not yet. Wait. That is the voice of one who has schooled herself too long. When Deacon's plot miscarried, she took the shortest road left to her, through a file. Laudanum has smoothed many a Victorian conscience. It would have smoothed an infant's breath equally. He smoked for a while in silence. "Do not mistake me, Watson. I have no taste for Pharisees. The law will do as it must. I only note that in this city the bricks are set so that a woman like Miss Harrow may be praised for 30 years for virtues which are only the slow starving of herself, and then be damned in 30 minutes for the single act by which she tries to buy herself back. There is tragedy in that, but tragedy is no defence." "You refused Mrs. Winterbourne's fee," said I, for I had seen him push away the envelope with an impatience that had something of shame in it. "I refused an arithmetical error," he returned shortly. Then his mouth softened. "She sent me instead a jar of quince marmalade of her own making, which I shall put to a better use than the Treasury would make of a cheque." We were interrupted by a second knock, a timid tap this time, followed by Miss Vale's card upon the salver. Holmes shot me a look and nodded. She came in with the air of one who has rehearsed her courage upon the stair and hopes to keep it alive until she has said her piece. She thanked Holmes with a warmth that would have embarrassed a less stubborn man, and then, colouring, produced from her reticule a scrap of paper. "I found this, Mr. Holmes, in the nursery grate behind the fender. Nurse says it was there when she cleaned this morning. It was a triangle torn from a draft in Deacon's hand, a schedule of witnesses available, with the names of 2 clerks and underlined twice, E.H. I thought," she added, "it might be of use if anyone should question whether Eliza had been drawn into this by another, or whether she—" Holmes raised a hand. "You do her more service than you know. Take courage, Miss Vale. Truth is the only advocate that does not snore. Give this to Lestrade with my compliments." When she had gone, he stood a moment very still, the scrap between finger and thumb. "There is a species of loyalty, Watson," he said at last, "which belongs to the brave. It is often found in women whom the world, for want of a better word, calls useful. The world seldom knows how much it owes them." He roused himself then, as if shaking off a mood. "We have done enough sentiment for one day. If you have no pressing appointment with your patients, I propose to test a small experiment upon our own floorboards. You shall stand in the passage, I will take the violin into the coal scuttle, and we shall see whether a G upon the 4th string will make Mrs. Hudson think her kettles speak." I laughed, and he with me, and so, with the city still muttering beyond the window, the case of the whisper beneath the floorboards returned at last to the music from which it had stolen its opening note. Lestrade appeared that same afternoon, smelling of wet serge and triumph. He set a leather case upon our table with the reverence of a curate laying down a chalice. Holmes, who had been worrying the 4th string in search of a tone that would set Mrs. Hudson's teacups at speculative angles, as he phrased it, put the bow aside and opened the case with 2 fingers. "A travelling apothecary," he remarked. "Our Lazarus did not trust to miracle alone." Inside lay a small syringe, a stoppered phial labelled "Tinct," digitalis in a precise clerkly hand, and, beside it, chloral hydrate crystals in a folded paper. There was also a brown bottle of aromatic spirits of ammonia and a tiny tin of Vaseline, with the edge darkened where a finger had habitually smeared it. "Found in Deacon's inner pocket," said Lestrade. "He kept them snug under the tailor's padding. The clerks swear he carried his nervines for palpitations. One of them saw him dissolve chloral in port at chambers of an evening." Holmes's nostrils dilated a hair's breadth over the bottle. Enough of the one to give the skin that cold deceit, enough of the other to rally at a summons. He lay like a saint in a reredos till the house broke ranks, and then up he gets to do his worst work, under cover of the women's shrieks. Lestrade cleared his throat. "Worse work yet if you hadn't taken the nursery watch. The magistrate'll have him on conspiracy and theft as it stands, with a nice embroidery of fraud. As for Miss Harrow, attempted murder by laudanum is a hard word to fix in ink. The doctor's report says no dose was given. Your catching her with the bottle will weigh, but there's no corpse to point to." Holmes made a little gesture that might have meant relief. "The law's harshness is best reserved for men like Deacon, who practice their villainy as a profession." "Your clerks?" "Both turned like weathercocks the moment I put them in separate rooms," said Lestrade with grim satisfaction. "They admit he had 'em witness a New Testament naming a lady of our acquaintance. And here, Mr. Holmes, is where I hand you my hat. They first wrote the initials only. He made 'em scratch 'em out and set the whole in on fresh lines, for fear of over-familiarity upon inspection," he said. He pulled from his breast a second paper. "You'll like this," came by Miss Vale's hand through your boy. It was the triangle we had seen at breakfast, Deacon's draft with E.H., twice underlined. Lestrade tapped it. "Between this and the clerk's gabble, I'll satisfy any bench in London who coached him." Holmes regarded the scrap a moment, then, with that odd tenderness which sometimes transfigured his ascetic features, he laid it upon the mantel as one might lay a flower. "Miss Vale has a straight eye," he said. "If the world were divided into those who make devices and those who mend their mischief, she belongs in the latter company." Lestrade turned to the matter of the passage, and we had the pleasure of seeing him astonished again, For Mrs. Hudson, warned by Holmes, had reared upon our parlour floor a small facsimile of the Montague Street contrivance, a child's drum head under a loose board, a leather-sleeved wire, and a bell pull nailed to our skirting. Holmes stooped and murmured, and the floor gave back a ridiculous ghost of his own voice. The inspector started despite himself, laughed, then shook his head. "I'll have our builders pry every rat-run in that house," he said. The passage between the walls came with a modernizing 20 years ago, coal chute altered, servants' bells rehung, a fine gentleman's contrivance to get from pantry to study unseen. Deacon called it a convenience. I'll call it evidence. "Conveniences are the devil's cradles," Holmes returned. "They rock crimes to sleep." Lestrade took his leave, promising to send word when the charges were set. When the door had closed behind him, Holmes flung himself across the settee and lay with his hands laced behind his head, the old cat-like contentment stealing back about his mouth now that the chase had come to ground. I used the interval to put those remaining questions which troubled me. How did Deacon gain his audience with Jonah in the first place? The man swears only that a gentleman knew the house. "Deacon knew it," said Holmes. "He had drawn the very lease that recorded the alterations. He did not show his face until the second meeting at the area gate. The first was by note, 'Bring your tools to cure a draught in the nursery,' and a sovereign to teach the value of obedience. When one has handled 1,000 conveyances, one learns every cupboard a house possesses, those in the paper and those between the lines." "And the phrase," I persisted. "Why always, 'Not yet, wait'?" Holmes's gaze went up to the ceiling and dwelt there, not in idle fancy, but as though he saw through the plaster to a dim-lit room and a woman counting the beats of a clock. "Because her whole life had been that phrase," he said quietly. It was the litany she had said at her own heart until the words had no more meaning in the mouth than water in a ditch. When she needed a ghost, she borrowed the only tongue she owned. He rose on an elbow. "Stare at me as you please, Watson. I have not turned sentimental. The facts stand where we left them. A woman, neglected by gratitude, entered into a vile compact, and then, when that compact failed, she took one pace more toward the pit. The step was stopped, that is all, but the human subject bears noting, the more so because one meets it oftener than phosphorescent footprints or hounds with painted jaws. We were interrupted once more, this time by a messenger from Montague Street. Mrs. Winterbourne's hand shook in the lines of her note, but the words were steady. She wrote that she had read her husband's true will with Miss Vale beside her, that she would petition for leniency where it could be justly prayed, that the secret ways were being bricked, that Nurse Hannah had taken to scolding the bell wires as if they were sinners, and that a jar of quince marmalade would follow as soon as the grocer mended his temper about the jam sugar. Holmes smiled, folded the paper, and put it in his case. "The marmalade has already arrived," said I. "You refused the cheque." "Arithmetic again," he murmured. "Besides, the case has paid for itself." He nodded toward the violin. "You value your music above money?" "I value a problem that will sit and purr when stroked the right way," said he. "This one sang in the end. You observed how the parts came up in their turn? The bead on the fender, the gritty mark on the rug, the sleeve on the wire, the loop at the lock, the chimneys talking. A fugue, Watson, with the subject first whispered, then stated, then answered, and finally, resolved, he rose, touched the bow to the string, and drew from it a low, sweet note that hung in the air like breath upon a glass. In the room below, Mrs. Hudson cried out, "Hawks!" the kettle, and then laughed at herself. Holmes's eyes danced. "There," he said, "you may write that London muttered, and that the floorboards answered, but add, for the sake of accuracy, that the last word was spoken by a man with a fiddle." He set the instrument down and reached for his pipe. Outside, the fog pressed its cheek against our pane like a child too curious for bed. Holmes tamped the tobacco, struck a match, and watched the little flame live, tremble, and go out upon the draw. "Another case," I ventured. He shook his head. "Let the yard have this day. Tomorrow, perhaps, some other whisper will ask to be heard. London is built upon joists. Everything here speaks, if one listens." And so, with the city murmuring its endless undertone, and the marmalade cooling upon the sill, the adventure of the whisper beneath the floorboards came, as my friend had promised, not to a crash, but to a cadence. He sent one thin plume of smoke up to the ceiling and smiled, as if the boards themselves had bowed in acknowledgment and fallen, at last, respectfully silent. When a matter has been much in the newspapers, I have found it best, for accuracy's sake, to take the facts from Holmes's lips rather than from any printer's ink. In the fortnight that followed the events in Montague Street, the case was vigorously argued in clubs and omnibuses, and yet no two accounts agreed upon how a dead man managed to stain his fingers after burial, or how a whisper climbed stairs against the law of sound. Holmes, who read these debates with that thin, amused line at the corner of his mouth, consented at last to satisfy my curiosity upon those remaining points which a layman might still consider miraculous. "You will observe, Watson," he began, as we sat before our own hearth with the fog tapping the window like a polite caller, "that there is no miracle, only a handful of habits. The habit of a rogue to blister wax rather than break it, the habit of plaster to cling to a
kneeling knee, the habit of a careful woman to label a safe, the habit of a city to speak through its pipes and timbers, if one but stoops to listen. From such trifles the edifice rose, and, when pressed, spoke the truth." He drew from his case the very scrap of charred wax, and laid it upon my palm, then the bead of brown varnish which he had teased from the fender's hinge, then the little reel of silk with which he had turned the study key from the outside. Each was in itself a nothing. Together they were the sentence by which Deacon and Miss Harrow were condemned. Of the law's action I need only say that it moved with its usual gravity. Deacon, with the dark bloom upon his finger and the second testament in his chambers, found his clerks eager to be rid of fear. They told all, and his trade in forged codicils and improved wills unravelled as tidily as a lawyer's tape, when one finds the end. There were other names in his ledgers, which it is not my province to set down, for the yard very properly preferred quiet restitution to public scandal where it might spare honest households a sharper pain than justice requires. As for Miss Harrow, the charge that lay heaviest, attempt upon the child, could not be pressed to its bitter end, for Holmes's hand had closed upon her wrist before a drop passed the file's lip. Conspiracy and fraud were proved, intent was plain, and yet, when Mrs. Winterbourne's petition was read, a document written without flourish, with a sister's heart bleeding at every line, the magistrate did what English justice sometimes remembers to do. He counted the years of silent service, the provocation of fear and pride, and he tempered the iron. Jonah's case troubled Holmes more than he allowed Lestrade to see. The man had been a tool, and a clumsy one, yet without such tools the clever cannot build. He was held a fortnight and discharged with a warning and a place found for him by the vicar, who opined, rightly, that a man watched by his neighbours in the daylight is a safer citizen than one who skulks in the attics by night. There remained the question of the will. The true document, blistered but entire, was proved. The false, cunningly drawn in Deacon's hand with the residuary clause, shifted by inches, but not by justice, was burned in court under order of the bench. Mrs. Winterbourne kept her household and her child, and if I say that the household was smaller, I hope I shall not be accused of cruelty. Miss Harrow's absence was the one change which no rearrangement of furniture could conceal. She wrote once to her sister from the first sober refuge to which the law consigned her. It was a plain letter, neither excusing nor accusing, with a request that the nursery fire be kept low and the bell wires seen to, for sounds are terrible to those who have taught houses to speak. I confess that passage moved me more than any repentance might have done. Holmes, who is as hard as a file to humbug, and
yet soft as down to genuine feeling, read the letter twice and set it aside without comment. Only later, when we passed Montague Street together on an errand to the British Museum, did he touch my arm to check my step. The windows of number 14 were open to air. New brick showed fresh and honest where the wall between the passages had been closed, and a mason's boy with hair like tow and a whistle to match sat upon the area steps, eating a wedge of bread and jam with the untroubled absorption of one to whom floorboards are mere wood and not instruments of fear. A woman's stitchery, neat as print, was visible upon a blind. Miss Vale's hand, no doubt, for the young lady had remained at Mrs. Winterbourne's request until the house has done muttering. Holmes's eye rested for a moment on that small domestic sign, and then passed on. "You will have noticed," he said presently, "that two phrases governed this case from end to end. The first was, 'Not yet wait,' which our ghost repeated because a living woman had repeated it too long to herself. The second I kept for my own use, and what was that? 'Not yet' is half of wisdom, but it becomes folly when it is never followed by 'now.' There is a point when patience changes its coat and calls itself cowardice. Deacon counted upon the city's habit of not looking too closely, upon Lestrade's willingness to take syncope for an answer, upon women's training to believe that strong men know best. A little now in the right place turned the whole table. "You mean the wire?" I asked. "I mean everything," said he, with a flicker of a smile. "The silver nitrate upon the blotter, the loop under the door, the decision to lay bait in the drawing-room where a timid thief must reach across light rather than in shadow, the insistence upon keeping the will in the house to compel its owner to come for it. Had we said 'not yet' to any of those, Mrs. Winterbourne would this day be a bereaved beggar, and Deacon a man of consequence in his inn. He would not allow me to press him upon Miss Harrow's motives beyond what he had already said. "We are not confessors, Watson," he answered when I urged him. "We catch those who have done harm and, if we can, prevent more. When the heart is the battlefield, I prefer not to count the dead, for the numbers are always wrong. And yet I have seen him take from his case the little scrap of Deacon's draft with E.H. twice underlined, and lay it, for no reason of science, where the firelight might soften it. And I know that he sent without comment the first jar of quince marmalade that reached Baker Street straight back to Montague Street with our landlady's compliments, keeping only the second for himself. That was his way of adjusting the account. One tiny knot remained for my curiosity, how he fixed, in the first minutes of our visit, upon the study fender as the scene of the paper's half-destruction. He laughed outright at that. My dear fellow, where else? The safe's recess was dusted like a convent's table. The escritoire smelt of lavender, not smoke. The hearth alone wore that dull, intentional heat on one hinge and a smear of wax among its ashes. A fire tells you how it has been used. Most men never ask it. If a man warms a document to blister a seal, he will brace the packet on metal. His fingers are not salamanders. And when he is a methodical solicitor, he will pick a place he can clean afterward, a hinge that can be polished, a grate that can be raked. He counts upon women not to run their fingers along joints of iron. He had not counted upon me. When at last he had satisfied my importunate mind, he took up the violin and laid the bow across the strings with that peculiar tenderness which he reserved for the instrument and for no living creature save, perhaps, one other. A low note sounded, and, as if on cue, Mrs. Hudson below stairs clucked at her kettle. We both smiled. Outside, the fog was already turning from slate to pearl, where the winter light groped at it. London, like some huge sleeper, turned on its pillow and went on muttering. "Holmes," said I when he paused, "you spoke, on the first morning of it, of London's murmur. It seems to me that in this case the city itself taught you the truth." "The city," he returned, "and a woman's patience, and a rogue's vanity, and a little chemistry. The universe is liberal with clues to those who are not proud." He set the fiddle in its place and reached for his pipe. "There will be other whispers, Watson." They always come. The trick is to know which are boards and which are men." He struck the match. The flame flowered and died into a steady glow. And thus, with smoke rising in the dimming air and my friend's profile cut hard against the fire, the matter of the whisper beneath the floorboards came to its last quiet. London kept up its endless undertone, the child in Montague Street kept his sleep, and Holmes, having once more persuaded a city to speak, was content for an hour at least to let it.